73 seconds. That's how long it took to kill 7 people on live television. But what nobody tells you is that inside that cabin, in the final moments before everything ended, someone was still trying to flip the emergency switches. Someone was still trying to do something. They didn't die in the explosion. The crew cabin separated intact. And for almost 3 minutes, 3 full minutes, it fell toward the ocean with the crew still inside.
What happened in those 3 minutes, nobody knows for certain. What happened the night before, that's what NASA tried to bury.
To understand why Challenger hit the way it did, why this explosion landed differently from any disaster before or since, you have to understand what the Space Shuttle program was supposed to mean in 1986. NASA had been flying shuttle missions since 1981. By January of that year, they had completed 24 successful flights. The agency had spent years selling the shuttle as something almost routine, a reusable spacecraft that would launch as reliably as an airplane, carrying satellites, conducting experiments, eventually making spaceflight ordinary. The shuttle program was built around the idea that this was no longer the wild frontier of the Apollo era. This was the mature phase, reliable, repeatable, safe.
And to prove just how safe and ordinary it had all become, NASA had launched a program called Teacher in Space. The idea was simple. Select one American school teacher, train them, and send them to orbit, not as a scientist or an engineer, but as a civilian, as a symbol that space was now accessible to everyone. 37-year-old Krista McAuliffe, a high school social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, had been chosen from more than 11,000 applicants. She had spent months training at the Johnson Space Center. She was going to broadcast lessons from orbit. She was going to be the first ordinary American citizen in space, building slightly. The media coverage around her was enormous. NASA had deliberately ensured that. And because she was a teacher, and because her lesson plans were going to come from space, schools across the country had arranged for their students to watch the launch live. Hundreds of thousands of children sitting in front of televisions, watching. Remember that.
Now, let's go back 6 months to July 31st, 1985. On that day, an engineer named Roger Boisjoli, who worked for Morton Thiokol, the company contracted to build the solid rocket boosters for the shuttle, sat down and wrote a memo to his company's vice president of engineering. It was not a casual note. It was a formal, detailed warning. Boisjoli had been studying the O-rings, the rubber seals that fit between the segments of the solid rocket boosters, designed to prevent hot combustion gases from escaping through the joints. He had found evidence of erosion, of blow-by, of the seals failing to do their job. And what he had found scared him badly enough to put it on paper in the bluntest possible terms. He wrote that if the problem was not fixed immediately, the result would be a catastrophe of the highest order, loss of human life. He sent the memo. Management acknowledged it. A task force was assigned to study the problem. And the shuttle kept flying. 5 more missions launched in the second half of 1985, all of them with the same unresolved O-ring issue. Each one that came back safely made the risk feel a little smaller. There's a name for this. Sociologist Diane Vaughan coined it after studying this exact disaster. She called it the normalization of deviance. When a known problem doesn't immediately cause a catastrophe, organizations start to treat the problem as acceptable. The line between dangerous and routine blurs a little more each time. Until one day, it
doesn't.
By January 1986, Krista McAuliffe and her 6 crewmates were at Kennedy Space Center, waiting to launch. The mission had already been delayed 6 times. Weather, technical issues, scheduling. The launch was now set for January 28th. The overnight forecast for Cape Canaveral was brutal. Temperatures were expected to drop to between 18 and 26 degrees Fahrenheit, far colder than any shuttle had ever launched in before. And for Roger Boisjoli and his colleagues at Morton Thiokol, that number, 18 degrees, was the number that made everything they had been warning about feel suddenly and terrifyingly real. Cold does something to rubber. It makes it stiff. It makes it inflexible. And an O-ring that can't flex properly can't seal. And if the seal failed, hot gases would escape through the joint. And if hot gases escaped through the joint, Boisjoli already knew what happened next. He had written it down 6 months ago. On the evening of January 27th, the night before the launch, Morton Thiokol convened a teleconference with NASA officials. Boisjoli and 4 other engineers laid out their case. They presented data. They explained the relationship between temperature and O-ring performance. They showed that below 53 degrees Fahrenheit, the risk of seal failure increased dramatically. They recommended, formally, that the launch be postponed.
The risks are acceptable. Proceed with the launch.
The reaction from NASA was not what they expected. Officials pushed back hard. One NASA manager said, and this line has been quoted in engineering ethics courses ever since, that it sounded like Thiokol was asking NASA to wait until April. Back to measured tension. The pressure on the phone was intense, and after a while, Morton Thiokol management asked for a few minutes off the line to discuss their position internally. What happened in those minutes is one of the most studied moments in the history of engineering ethics. The managers called a meeting, and they deliberately excluded the engineers, Boisjoli and the others who had been making the case against the launch, from that meeting. When they came back on the phone, their recommendation had changed. The data, they said, was inconclusive. They were approving the launch. It was the first time in the entire history of the shuttle program that NASA had received an explicit no-launch recommendation from a major contractor and overruled it. Boisjoli went home that night knowing what was going to happen. The next morning, he drove to the Thiokol facility in Utah and sat down in front of a television screen with his colleagues to watch the launch. At 11:38 a.m., Challenger lifted off. The temperature at Cape Canaveral that morning was 36 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest launch in shuttle history, even after a 2-hour delay hoping for warming that never came. On the ground, icicles hung from the launch tower, up to 16 inches long in some places. Calm, procedural, for the first few seconds, everything appeared normal. The shuttle climbed into a clear, cold Florida sky. The NASA commentator reported speed and altitude in the calm, routine voice of someone who had done this dozens of times. Tense at 0.678 seconds after ignition, less than 1 second into the flight, a puff of black smoke appeared at the base of the right solid rocket booster, precisely at one of the joints Boisjoli had warned about. The smoke meant hot gases were already escaping, but the cold had temporarily compressed the gap shut again. The flight continued. At T+37 seconds, the shuttle rolled into the correct heading. The crew reported back normally. At T+58 seconds, the point of maximum aerodynamic stress, the temporary seal gave way. The hot gases were escaping again. A flame appeared on the side of the right booster, small at first, then growing, accelerating slightly. It burned through a strut, connecting the booster to the external fuel tank. The strut failed. The booster rotated. Its nose punched directly
into the liquid hydrogen tank above it. At T plus 73 seconds, the external tank ruptured. The liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen detonated. The orbiter was torn apart, traveling at nearly twice the speed of sound. The two solid rocket boosters, suddenly free, kept flying on their own for another 37 seconds before range safety officers sent the self-destruct command.
And the crew cabin, intact, separated cleanly from the rest of the vehicle, continued upward on its momentum. It coasted to 65,000 feet, and then it began to fall. Later investigation found that at least 3 crew members had activated their emergency personal egress air packs after the breakup. They were alive after the explosion. For almost 3 minutes, they fell. Back in Utah, Roger Boisley watched it happen on the screen.
We made it.
We all knew exactly what had happened, he said later. One of his colleagues had turned to him just a minute into the flight and said, relieved, "Oh God, we made it. We made it." Then, a few seconds later, the shuttle was gone. His colleague Bob Ebling had driven to the facility that morning with his daughter. On the way, he was beating his fist on the dashboard, telling her the shuttle was going to blow up, that everyone was going to die. When it happened, she said she could feel him trembling next to her. And then he wept. In the weeks after the explosion, both men became anonymous sources for journalists piecing together what had really happened. When Boisley eventually testified publicly before the Presidential Commission, he called the management meeting the night before an unethical decision-making forum resulting from intense customer intimidation. He was meticulous, specific, devastating, and the consequences for him were immediate. Thiokol reassigned him from spacewalk. His colleagues distanced themselves. One told him he would drop his kids on Boisley's doorstep if they all lost their jobs because of his testimony.
He resigned from Morton Thiokol soon after. For the rest of his life, he traveled to engineering schools around the world, speaking about that night, about what it means when the people who know the most about a system's risks are excluded from the final decision. He did this for nearly 3 decades. Near the end of his life, he told his wife, "This is what I was meant to do, to have impact on young people's lives." He died in 2012.
It was not
The
an
Rogers
accident
Commission,
waiting
the
to
presidential
happen.
panel convened to investigate the disaster, published its findings in June 1986. The technical cause was clear: O-ring failure due to cold temperatures. But the commission went further. It found that NASA management had been aware of the O-ring problem for years. It found that safety culture at NASA had been hollowed out by schedule pressure, by the need to hit launch targets, to demonstrate reliability, to justify the program's existence. It found a pattern in which known risks were repeatedly normalized and accepted, launch after launch, right up until the moment they became catastrophic. The commission concluded that it was not an accident waiting to happen. It was an accident that had been predicted, documented, argued against, and launched over the explicit objections of the people who understood it best.
The shuttle program was grounded for nearly 3 years. When it returned, significant changes had been made to the booster design, to the safety protocols, to the way dissenting voices in engineering teams were supposed to be heard before a launch decision. Supposed to be. And in schools across the country, a generation of children who had watched the sky split open on a Tuesday morning in January were left with something that never quite went away. A memory of sitting in a classroom, of silence, of not understanding what they had just seen. Krista McAuliffe's backup, a teacher named Barbara Morgan, waited 21 years. In 2007, she flew on the Space Shuttle Endeavour and completed the lessons that McAuliffe had prepared. By then, the children who had watched Challenger in their classrooms were in their 30s.
The Challenger disaster is taught in business schools and engineering schools not as a story about a technical failure. Technically, the failure was understood. It was preventable. It was predicted in writing 6 months before it happened. It is taught as a story about what organizations do when they need something to succeed so badly that they restructure their decision-making to make success the only possible conclusion. They exclude the dissenters. They reframe the data. They ask the engineers to prove the rocket will fail instead of proving it is safe. Roger Boisjoli knew. Bob Ebeling knew. Alan MacDonald knew. They said so. Very quiet. They were overruled. Long pause. That is the thing that doesn't go away. If you want to understand the second disaster that proved NASA had not fully learned the lessons of Challenger, that video is right there. And if this kind of storytelling is what you came here for, subscribe. These are the stories that changed everything, and most of them had someone who tried to stop it first.